Okay, so if you're still listening to Golden Dove's classes, congratulations. We're class 78, and admittedly this material requires a lot of thought, and a lot of deep thought actually. So this is class 78, I said, of the Golden Doves. We're on the bottom, the very last sentence of page 42, and let's go through this, because it ain't getting any easier for a while. I don't mean to discourage anyone, I just want to be accurate in the way I portray this subject. Person is a dialectical category. This is my father writing. So we spoke about linguistic subjectivity, and the I exists relative to the second person to whom the first person is talking, and there's a reciprocal relationship. So person is a dialectical category, which can neither be derived from society nor be reduced to individuals. If you look at society, the concept of society, within society you don't have this idea of dialectics, because in society everybody is subsumed by whatever the unifying principle is, whether the unifying principle is nationhood, a flag, a sporting event. We all unify by our love or adoration of a particular team. So that's society. So within society, individuals are subsumed. There is no dialectical relation between I and you. So it can be derived from, so person cannot be derived from society, nor be reduced to individual. Also, the person can't be reduced to the individual, because as we said, individual exists alone. It's a static concept. Whereas person, in the sense that we're talking about it, linguistic person can only exist in that dialectical relationship. And here we're reading Emile Benveniste. And so the old antinomies of I and the other, right? So you have the antinomies of I. So you have the self, me, and of course the other. So we exist in opposition to each other, right? So in the pagan world, there's always a power game. The reason you need the power game is because I exist in opposition to the people outside of me. We all want the same things. So there's a war, there's always going to be this struggle, there's always going to be this conflict. So it's an antinomy between myself and the people outside of me, or the other, let's call it, right? The other, of course, is evil, because they threaten me. I threaten them as well, right? So this antinomy of I versus the other, or I like self versus the other, of the individual and society, says an antinomy between, you have the individual who exists as an autonomous entity, and then you have society which subsumes the individual. So we have these, in metaphysical thinking, you have these absolute things that exist independently, but they exist in a sense that opposes, there's an antinomy, a conflict between these things. That's why in metaphysical thinking, polytheism is of the essence. There's always going to be a war between the gods, right? Because each god exists independently of the other god. So you have the self and the other, right? It is a duality, which is illegitimate. So Benveniste says this duality between self and the other, between the individual and society, it's wrong. It is a duality which is illegitimate. It's illegitimate because it causes hostility and power games and conflict and wars. And erroneous, to reduce to a single primordial term. So when you reduce, whether this term be the I, which must be established in the individual's own consciousness in order to become accessible to that of the fellow human being. So you're going to reduce the person to an I. An I is an objectifiable entity. It's what I feel about myself, alone and independent of everything around me, right? So first I understand myself. After I understand myself, I want to make it accessible to other human beings. Perhaps I want to impose my will on other human beings, right? Or whether it be on the contrary, society, which as a totality would pre-exist the individual. So another unique term. So one of the unique terms is I. I not in the sense of the personal pronoun, but I in the sense of an objectifiable self. Or you can have another term, society, which is that as a totality would pre-exist the individual. Society comes before the individual is born into society. So the individual relies on society in a sense to exist, and from which the individual could be disengaged gradually in proportion to acquisition of self-consciousness. So as I acquire self-consciousness, I want to disengage myself from society, right? So there's me versus society. There's a limited number of resources. I want those resources for myself. Society will perhaps tell me, allocate the resources. I don't want to allocate them. I want more for myself. Society imposes rules upon me, which limit what I can do. I want to be a cowboy. I want freedom, right? So you see, you have these antinomies, self versus the other, individual versus society. So Benveniste rejects these antinomies, and rightfully so. It is in a dialectic reality that will incorporate the two terms and define them by mutual relationship. So there is no objectifiable I. Rather, there is an I relative to you, or relative to the third person. So I, me, myself, am defined by my relationship with you. And I understand that you can also become an I. I am defined by my relationship to the third person, and the third person is defined by his relationship to me. And society is affected by me, and I'm affected by society. That's the dialectic reality. Right? So again, it is a dialectic reality that Benveniste is espousing here, that will incorporate the two terms and define them by mutual relationship, that the linguistic basis of subjectivity is discovered. Only when you have this dialectic relationship and you don't view the other as an enemy, as evil, as opposed to me, but rather you view the other as a person like me, through whom I can learn something about myself, or perhaps I see in him or her something that I see in myself. So there is this relationship where I discover myself through the other. Well, it's not the other anymore, that's the point, right? All the wars in pagan society are based upon a failure to appreciate what my father and what Benveniste are writing about. All these wars are based upon these constructs, these mental constructs, that the other is necessarily my enemy, right? And therefore I should treat him as an enemy. I exist objectifiably and independently of everything else, and therefore everything threatens me. And so what do we have? We have power games. How do I attain power? Through violence. And if you have more violence, you have more power, and you will be able to assert your own self in a way that affects and hurts others. So all the governments of the world are based upon this predicate. The state of Israel today also is just based upon power. So there's different, parties, different political parties. Well, perhaps they parrot certain words, religion or secular, or whatever the words they power, or whatever the words they parrot are irrelevant. There will be this government won't lead to the Geulah in its current state, because it's all about power games, and power games are the games the Goyim play. So Am Yisrael plays this power game as well, because it fails to understand these fundamental principles, right? And that's why it's so important to study these principles. These principles are transformative, truly transformative. I'm going to read another paragraph now. That was the end of Benveniste's quote. There is another aspect worth considering of Benveniste's category of person. Person is real only in the act of speech or in discourse. Wow. So only through actually speaking can there be the category of person. In fact, the category of person is the ground upon which language is turned into instances of discourse. Only because you have people speaking, right, can you have the person. It's through speech that the person asserts himself, not just as a first person, but as a potential second person. So rather than power games, you have, right, opposition, war, I'll punch you, you'll try to punch me. Speech, first person speaking to second person, inviting second person to become first person, that's communication, that's respect, that's ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. A few remarks on Saussure's distinction between language, lang, and speech, parole, will clarify this point. Give me a moment. I want to check footnote 13 in the back, and I apologize for not having done so before starting the class, but I want to make sure. Yes, so what we were reading, the previous paragraph was Emil Benveniste. It sounded like him, but now we're switching to Saussure, so I wanted to make sure that this is the transition to Saussure. So a few remarks on Saussure's distinction between language and speech will clarify this point, and we will save this for the next class.